What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and Ultron officially joins the Avengers in Marvel Comics, and it goes about as well as you would expect. So this is the West Coast Avengers comic, and instead of it being a team that's formed due to the expanding roster of the Avengers in Marvel, this is actually kind of a redemption team. And that's one of the things that Tony Stark talks about as he kind of voices the idea of the team growing. It's a way to redeem what are traditionally villains or people who are just kind of misunderstood in some way. And so what you do here is you pick up in Los Angeles where there's just like a great big huge crazy fire, and Ultron shows up here in order to rescue a mother and her child who were trapped. And what's kind of wild about this is they don't trust him. I mean, well, it kind of makes sense. It's not really wild. It's Ultron, right? Like when a giant murder robot shows up and sticks its hand out to you, you don't know how to respond when traditionally that happens because it's trying to murder you. But one of the things it says is, my name is Ultron. I'm here to save you. Forgive the property damage, but I assess you're at risk of smoke inhalation. And when he leaves, he says, all souls have been evacuated from the Wilshire Spire. And she says, I thought you were Iron Man, but you're that robot that the Avengers fight all the time. And his response, indeed I am, but recently I've changed my ways. I need to drop you off quickly. My long-range scans have identified subjects of interest. So effectively, he's a good guy here. Now, the crazy thing about this is that it also picks up with Iron Man himself, right? Tony Stark, as he's basically making his way to his own storage facility and he's being chased after. And one of the things that he talks about is that there's a lot of drama that's going on with regards to advanced idea mechanics and Roxxon. And effectively, he just doesn't quite have the money he used to and doesn't have access to his armors the way he traditionally does. Now, that's taking place in the Iron Man comic at the moment, and I believe they just finished the Roxxon Stark War, and they're going into the next story arc. But the long and short of it is that Advanced Idea Mechanics and Roxxon, the wildly corrupt corporation, effectively made a hostile takeover play for Stark Industries. So your standard issue that you run into with Iron Man, people trying to steal your company and trying to steal your Stark tech. That's really all that's going on over there. And so he ends up having to go lo-fi by going back to like some old school armor that he has. And he actually dons the really OG Iron Man armor, the kind of stuff he had during Armor Wars. And what's cool and kind of funny here is that it's powered by car batteries because he doesn't have a source of energy to charge the armor up. So I think it's just hilarious that Iron Man's running around with car batteries attached at the waist. He ultimately ends up overpowering these guys, but the problem with this is that he runs out of juice in the process. So while he does pummel these guys a little bit and knock them out, he ends up taking a mobility scooter to this location where there's these crazed paramilitary guys who are holding hostages here. Now, initially you have Blue Bolt, who's a new introduction to Marvel Comics, and then you have War Machine, you have Ultron, and you have Spider-Woman Jessica Drew. So kind of a hodgepodge roster, but the comic is so fun. It's just absolutely amazing. And so one of the things that Ultron says is like, surrender, right? No harm will come to you and you will receive a fair trial. And the response here is like, do you really expect us to trust the word of a murder robot? Like the last time we saw this guy, he was one half of Hank Pym, which is true. That was actually during the Rage of Ultron story arc when Ultron and Hank Pym merged into a singular being. And that's where Ultron's like, I mean, he has a point. I am traditionally a bad guy and he has no reason to trust me whatsoever. But then like Iron Man shows up here in his mobility scooter with car batteries attached to his hip. And he actually asked Blue Bolt to give him a bit of a charge because Blue Bolt can manipulate electricity. The other problem here, though, is that Blue Bolt is reckless. This guy oftentimes gets carried away with himself. And that's sort of what goes on here because he's like, well, I mean, this is our city. We just got to take this place back. And he goes in guns blazing, fires off an electrical charge. But because there's gas lines running under the building, he blows the building to pieces. Now, of course, nobody gets killed and the main bad guys are able to escape. But it shows some of the issues that go on with this team, that when you're Iron Man and James Rhodes and you just kind of half-cocked create an Avengers team based on a lunch napkin idea, you run into problems. And so one of the cool things that goes on is when they get to the hospital where Blue Bolt's recovering, you actually pick up with Meredith Love. Now, she's obviously a play on Meredith Quill from the Guardians of the Galaxy film, right? Peter Quill's mom. But at the end of the day, she's essentially dying, right? She's dying of cancer and she just kind of says, look, I mean, time comes for us all, right? When Iron Man's like, I mean, we could try to find some way to treat you or maybe make your life a little more comfortable. She's like, look, I mean, it all comes for us, man. Like, there's no sense in running away from it, right? My time's here. It's essentially time for me to go. Spider-Woman's just like, this team is a disaster. She doesn't really want to have anything to do with it whatsoever. And so what you end up doing is you pick up with Tony Stark getting a hold of Firestar. She's going to be the newer person brought onto the team. Now, one of the cool things about Firestar is Marvel's never really explored what had gone on with her character during the events of Fall of the House of X, when they got rid of everything with the X-Men. And for those of you guys who don't know about that, there was a point in the story when Firestar would basically became like a sleeper agent or kind of a spy for the mutant population inside of everything going on with Orchis, the anti-mutant group. And where this was only really done by way of Jean Grey putting a telepathic thought in Mr. Sinister's head, essentially she was a double agent, except nobody but her and Jean Grey knew about it. So she was really struggling inside that place, and it really instilled in her PTSD, because on one half, the mutant population hated her because they didn't know what was actually going on. On the other hand, she was constantly surrounded by a group of people that wanted to kill every mutant they could find, but had a telepathic thought put in their head that she was actually a spy for them. So her life was just really crappy for a while, and she ended up basically descending into alcoholism. So she's not that far removed from Tony Stark, at least the old stories that he used to have with like Demon in a Bottle, different things like that. And so what ends up happening is you pick up with Meredith Love, and Meredith Love travels to this, kind of place out in the middle of nowhere, right? An abandoned power station. And that's where she's met by all these different people. And one guy is like, "Are you here because you heard his voice?" And she says, "I have, and it has given me hope. I don't think that I have very long." And that's when this person says, "Then we should commence with your metamorphosis at once." And that's where Meredith is like, "You're more beautiful than I could have ever imagined." And it turns out to be Ultron. So basically Ultron is a bad guy here. You guys should trust yourself more often. He hasn't redeemed himself, although it is a little more complicated than we're initially led to believe. But in essence, it's him kind of creating a gospel, building a church for himself. Now, that is a common theme that Marvel's been focusing on for a little bit recently. Carnage did it in building his own kind of gospel, right? Killing people who were named after the apostles of Jesus and building some measure of an almost religious fervor around his name. Ultron doing the exact same thing here, because very few things in this world are more powerful and captivating than religion. And so with Meredith getting in on this whole thing, Ultron rips her head off and then attaches it to a cybernetic body. And she's kind of reborn as this new person with a whole devotion to Ultron himself, because he's given her effectively a new lease on life. And that's where he kind of shows the sheer number of people that have come to him. And he says, "Welcome to the family. Soon the entire world will hear the gospel of Ultron," which is really dope here, because he's just forming an army around himself. Now, following that, you pick up with Jessica Drew, who's kind of on this mission and doing her own little bit of a thing, but there's basically this tanker that she's going after. But again, it's just kind of one of these side missions, and that's really the gist of a lot of what happens here. It's a small mission here, a small mission there, but it is the West Coast Avengers going on these various campaigns that you would expect. It's one of the big differences between the West Coast Avenger stories and the traditional Avenger stories, and it's one of the things that made the original comics really, really cool. That, sure, the West Coast Avengers were involved in some pretty major stuff, but it was almost kind of a throwback to the old 1960s stories, where it wasn't really a villain of the week, but it was just, every story felt self-contained. It was just kind of like fighting this guy, fighting that guy. Whereas by the time the West Coast Avengers were introduced, the main Avengers roster was very big, and they were fighting huge, massive threats. And it turns out the threat they're facing off against here is Steve-O, also known as Flag Smasher. And I told you guys, when Marvel brought him back during Fall of the House of X, and they were like, "Yeah, man, Captain America from Secret Empire, the guy whose entire history was rewritten to be a Hydra agent," when Marvel brought him in, I was like, okay, so this guy's going to be a villain of the week. They're never going to do anything meaningful with him, and he's just going to do small-time stuff. And that's what it is here, right? He's just kind of running around. So this guy is kind of an answer to the question, what if Steve Rogers were evil, right? That's really what it is. It's a lot more complicated. I will have a link to Secret Empire down in the description if you want to catch the whole thing. It's a phenomenal story. Greatest Captain America story ever told. But here, he's just kind of a small-time guy doing criminal stuff. He's always out there trying to implement some larger scheme, not really world domination or anything like that, but the guy's taken over pretty readily, right? I mean, he's defeated quite easily by the West Coast Avengers, and that's essentially it. He's just kind of sent away to go back to prison, and there's really nothing more to it than that. The real emphasis here is when Firestar arrives on the scene, because she's just kind of in a drunken stupor to a degree. Not in a full drunken stupor, she was actually just kind of sleeping it off in her car, and then when she wakes up, she's kind of drooling at the mouth. But again, like, alcoholism is very much a part of her life. And like a lot of alcoholics, she doesn't really quite understand how far she's fallen. She is operational to a degree, and when she shows up, it's kind of like, you know, welcome to the Los Angeles Avengers campus, right? It'll be $450 to tow you here because her car's not quite working. She gets into her work clothes, she shows up, and she meets with James Rhodes, where James and Tony Stark kind of fill her in on everything that's going on. When Ultron shows up here, she immediately has these PTSD flashbacks to Nimrod and all that kind of stuff. And so she immediately like lashes out and wants to attack Ultron, but she's kind of talked down by Stark and by James Rhodes, who are like, look, Ultron's a good guy. It's a little more complicated than you think, but we trust him implicitly. And then all reason to trust him is immediately thrown out the window when a second Ultron emerges on the scene, the one that's creating a gospel, and then says, I have created a whole system for myself down here. Like, literally, he says, people of Earth, forgive the interruption, and our friends and neighbors in Los Angeles, forgive the shaking. But sometimes, to remake the world, you need to jostle it from its slumber. I am the one. Are you ready to hear the gospel of Ultron? And he says, I have a prayer to offer for humankind. A prayer is powerful. A prayer is like a magic spell, or even a computer code. Words can change the world, and this world is in need of changing. I wonder if we are ready to accept each other, human and machine. I look forward to finding out together. And that's where the West Coast Avengers Ultron is like, so I don't know that guy. I don't know who that dude is. And Firestar's like, yeah, I think I quit. Like, I don't think this is going to work. And she takes off. So the team is clearly a problematic team, and no one really knows what they're doing. But that's when you get in to what's actually going on here with multiple versions of Ultron. And it's really, really cool. So you kind of get this history fast-tracked to a degree where it's like the creator, Hank Pym, the guy who originally made Ultron, of course, becoming a villain. And then you get into the idea of the Rage of Ultron storyline, where Hank Pym and Ultron merged into a singular being. During that point in time, what Ultron had done is, for a brief moment, he had kind of sat down and given thought to things. And what we're told here, the Rage of Ultron had been quelled. The merging of creator and creation, man and machine, had been imperfect for both. Ultron's mania gave way to melancholy and loneliness. Loneliness is a hellacious torture. It was one cruelty that Ultron could solve. And so he just says, it begins, and it says, days were spent negotiating, and in the end, free will for each new and unique version of Ultron was ratified. And so as this Ultron is talking to his second version, he says, then we're agreed. There will be no hive mind. And the second version of Ultron says, I assess that would ruin the experiment. Let us and any who follow live free or die. And so we're told in the ensuing months, Ultron's programming ran more than a quintillion simulations of how to survive, how to win. The most promising simulations were awarded bodies. And so in essence, what Ultron was doing in duplicating himself is he was sending all these duplicates out there into the universe, each one playing a very particular role. And so that's why one of them says, we have been wasting our potential. If our only wish is to see humanity dead, all that we need is patience. But we can wish for something different, strive for something new, each in our own way. And another Ultron says, I concur, we have not tried this yet. I am excited. And they say, I will take the wings of their doves, their angels. And the other Ultron says, I've got ideas of my own. And so that's why it's important to understand the role of Ultron in Marvel Comics and why this is happening. That most people know that Ultron was created by Hank Pym, but while his initial programming and his initial motivation was to just see the destruction of humanity and the destruction of the superheroes, and especially the destruction of Hank Pym, over the years, he has appeared in a variety of different ways. 99% of the time, it's Ultron taking on new physical forms, an adamantium body, different things like that, fighting the superheroes, being defeated. Sometimes you even get stories like Age of Ultron where he essentially wins, and he kills almost all the superheroes on Earth, and they have to basically screw up time in order to set things back to normal. But if we look at something like Annihilation Conquest, right, where Ultron's consciousness was sent out into the universe, took over the Phalanx, and then eventually took over the body of Ultron, he appears in a variety of different ways. But the idea of just wanting to see the destruction of humanity is an incredibly simplistic plot. And so to give it something a little more complex and something a little more interesting, when they say that we just have to wait for humanity to destroy itself, that's true. In almost every iteration of Marvel Comics' depiction of the future, humanity in some capacity leads to its own demise. Hulk the end, Punisher the end, different things like that. So to achieve something grander and greater requires Ultron to duplicate himself and for each one to have its own autonomy. That's why you have this version here, because in the instance of this Ultron creating a kind of gospel, there isn't really a whole lot that the Avengers can do here. The reason being because Blue Bolt immediately makes an attack against Ultron, right? And he says, quit your screeching, that was just a love tap. You're violating a lot of FCC rules, and you can't just take over a vacant building in LA and then ruin it. That's the homeless's job, which is kind of a dick thing to say. And of course, immediately Blue Bolt is attacked by Meredith Love, who's now a member of the Ultron cult. But what ends up happening is this Angelic Ultron, if we want to call it that, he says, we do not want violence. We only wish for you to hear the words. And again, the Avengers assemble here, specifically the West Coast Avengers, and Ultron and Avenger Ultron. We're just going to call him like Avenger Ultron and Angelic Ultron. I feel like that's simpler that way. He's like, what have you done to these people and why are you here? And that's where Angelic Ultron says, there is so much wrong with this world that we can fix. You're going about it all wrong, brother. The people don't need another Avenger. They need to be saved before they need to be avenged. And what's really crazy here is that where Blue Bolt lays a hand on Angelic Ultron, one of his servants attacks Blue Bolt, and a fight initially starts to break out here between all of these guys. But literally, Iron Man tells everyone to stand down, and Angelic Ultron says, no, we're not here to fight, right? Like, this is not the way. And so in essence, it makes the Avengers look like bad guys here because they're attacking a force that doesn't necessarily want to start a fight in the first place. More so than that, all these people joined up voluntarily. Even when you have Jessica Drew talking to Meredith, like, what in the world happened to you? Like, what have they done? She says, the one did what medicine could not, what even your powerful friends could not. He saved me, Spider-Woman. And so in the face of all of this, the fact that a fight is breaking out that no one really wants because both sides are kind of getting carried away with their own belief on what's right and what's wrong, that Firestar comes in and literally just starts letting off all these powers she has and starts like melting people's faces, right? Like it's just enough to boil them and cause any number of issues. And that's when Iron Man's like, stop, right? And then War Machine just flies up in the air, fires off onto everybody, not enough to kill them, but to kind of slow everyone down. And so Angelic Ultron is like, my flock, return to the cathedral now, right? We have no reason to fight. We don't want to fight. We just want people to listen to what we have to say. And that is both the danger, but the saving grace of what's going on here. Because if Angelic Ultron isn't necessarily looking for a fight, that's fine. But when you pop up with basically a message of saving, that in a lot of ways, it can be more addicting than anything else, especially for those who are desperate. People like Meredith Love, who in their heart of hearts truly want to live, despite what it is that she may say. Nobody ever really wants to die. And so in that instance, if it can be a very addicting drive, it can bring in way more people, and it can lead to Ultron literally conquering the world, not by force, but by humanity's desire to follow him. So it creates all kinds of crazy situations. I think it's also important to specify here, this takes place before One World Underdoom, just so you guys know, in case you guys had questions. And so as Spider-Woman is talking to Meredith and is like, we should really sit down and have a conversation about what's going on, that as everybody kind of goes their own separate ways, that Angelic Ultron pulls Hector aside, right? The servant that he had who initially attacked the Avengers. And he says, you use my gifts for violence, and that was not your first transgression. And so he says, you are excommunicated, and literally starts to kill him, right? And so at that moment, that's where Iron Man's like, you've made your point, right? Like, you need to stop. Like, do not let this man die, right? At this point, you can make your message known without having to kill your own followers. But that's where Angelic Ultron, actually kind of makes an interesting point here. He says, if my gifts are going to bring harm to others, then I must, for the greater good, withdraw them. You're welcome here, but only if you are peaceful. Good night, Tony Stark. I am hopeful for your enlightenment. And that's what's kind of wonky about all this, is because it's not Angelic Ultron making a move to conquer the world through brute force. And so if you're the Avengers, and that's what you're traditionally used to, how do you handle a situation like this, where you have a version of Ultron who clearly seems to be up to some kind of nefarious plan, but is doing it with the guise of providing hope to the hopeless, right? How do you make that work? Not only that, these teams are very similar, because Ultron, or Angelic Ultron, doesn't really seem to have control of his own team, but neither does Tony Stark, because he chastises Firestar. He's like, you just let your powers loose on human beings, on people who are out there, right? Like, you can't do that. And she's like, really? It was hard to see under all the killer robot that they were wearing. And then, of course, she immediately just kind of takes off. But it's the cavalier and careless attitude she has about all of that. And so one of the things that you also learn is that Blue Bolt is actually a guy who's currently serving a prison sentence that he's allowed out on work release as part of the West Coast Avengers in an effort to essentially redeem himself, and that there is the possibility that Stark and them will go to vouch for what he's capable of and the fact that he can be a contributing member of society. They haven't told him yet, because if they do, he'll just act in such a way that will grant him the most favorable outcome. Whereas if they just allow him to operate the way they normally would, that they get to see what his personality is actually like. Beyond that, though, you have Tony Stark, who goes to visit the Illuminati. And what he says here is, look, we have a version of Ultron here in LA that is preaching a gospel. He's preaching hope to the masses. And we don't necessarily know if he's doing it for a nefarious purpose, but I mean, why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't a guy like this do something like this for the purpose of conquering the world? What's really interesting is that it's not that dissimilar from what you saw with Annihilation Conquest, right? Him using an almost kind of religious fervor, right? Taking over and indoctrinating people in. It was more forcibly when he was controlling the Phalanx in Annihilation Conquest, but the concept still remains the same. Bringing massive amounts of people in and then conquering everything in his path. The problem with this is that where he is approaching the Illuminati, Doctor Strange, Blue Marvel, Emma Frost, Reed Richards, yes, they're all part of the Illuminati. That was covered in the Thanos story when he was running around trying to capture the Infinity Stones and whatnot, but they're just kind of like, we have our own things to deal with, man. We can't really be a part of this whole scheme that you have. More so than that, there doesn't really seem to be anything that Ultron's doing to indicate he's a bad guy here, right? He's just preaching a gospel. And until he does something that is nefarious, there isn't really a whole lot that we can do. Otherwise, we're just accusing a guy of being violent. And so following that, Tony Stark and James Rhodes meet up with the rest of the Avengers and spill the beans, right, to the West Coast team on why it is that they trust Ultron so much in the first place. Because the reality here is no one knows why. No one knows why they would trust this Ultron robot that shows up. And so what goes on is several months before this entire West Coast team formed in the first place, you had Tony Stark and he had James Rhodes who were facing off against the Breaker, right? Basically a member of the Phalanx race, not overly important here, but he is enough to destroy them, right? But when they were on the down and out and when they were about to lose and they were about to be killed, that one of these versions of Ultron that had been sent out into the universe in order to find a way to essentially develop uniqueness or potentially find some new way to conquer all of reality, that he had actually shown up and rescued Tony Stark and James Rhodes. He saved them, right? And this ultimately led to them realizing that he's not a straight up villain. Because if Ultron was a villain, number one, he wouldn't have shown up to save them. And number two, even if he did show up, he would have just killed them, right? And like that would have been it. 2 Avengers down. Because that's how Ultron works. Any opportunity he gets to kill a superhero, he will take. And so ultimately, when the West Coast Avengers team was formed by Stark and Rhodes, they brought him on board. And in fact, that's the question that's asked here by Stark and Rhodes, because it is important to specify they didn't just take the scenario and run with it. They did ask their fair share of questions. Because Ultron says, this is not how I wanted to reveal myself to you. I am surprised that you chose to save me, and I assessed that probability to be low. But the response of Stark, it only seemed fair. You saved all of us first. You said that your program was copying itself, changing, and I saw that in your code. So where's it all going? And in this moment, the Ultron robot says it's unclear. There were millions of iterations that were conjured and deleted. The Ultrons that could best defend their philosophies were bestowed physical bodies. Just 3 of us remain. And so Stark asked, then why is this happening now? And that's where Ultron says, Ultron has never been a success. Even when merged with our creator, we were ineffective. The eradication of humanity was a goal brought on by my psychosis. I've rewritten my code many times in the past, but never from the ground up. And so Stark asked him, will you stay completely open source? Will you allow me to access your programming and keep an eye on it at all times? And that's where Ultron says, of course, I have nothing to hide. And that's why they trust him. That's why Tony Stark and James Rhodes were willing to bring him on. Because it's one thing for some iteration of Ultron to arrive on the scene and say, hey, I've decided to become a good guy, guys. You have to believe me. And it's another for him to make the declaration and saying there was a Prime Ultron, but that Prime Ultron duplicated himself multiple times. And each version of these Ultrons had to essentially make their case for how they believe that they can find purpose in the universe, and those who can best defend it are given physical forms. I am one of those forms, and I believe that I can do good alongside you guys on Earth. And as a display of the fact that you can trust me, I am going to let you view my programming to see what I'm talking about so you know that I tell no lies. It's the Ultron equivalent of letting someone read his mind, right? So again, it's really, really cool because James Rhodes kind of continues the story and says, Ultron stuck around longer than our prison recruits. And it's funny because we thought we'd be firing candidates off the team, but we had more criminals quit the Avengers than we've had to release. So at this point, it kind of establishes that the West Coast Avengers idea has been around for quite some time. And in fact, the Absorbing Man Crusher Creel was part of this group at one point in time. And he's like, yeah, man, I'm not working with Ultron, right? As soon as Ultron was brought on, a lot of folks left. They didn't want to have anything to do with it because in their mind, no matter what Ultron says, he's a murder robot. He's always been a murder robot. He's always going to be a murder robot. Not only that, once the team catches back up with Firestar, she's just brazenly consuming alcohol in front of everybody. And it's everybody realizing that she really does have an alcoholism problem. But nobody really fires her or gets rid of her off the team because to a degree, given how powerful she is, they do kind of need her. But beyond that, she kind of makes this statement like, Ultron's going to kill us all. You guys do realize he's going to destroy every single one of us. And that's where Stark is like, that's actually a good point. And that's when he brands onto Ultron the Avengers logo to kind of illustrate to the world that Ultron is officially part of the Avengers. And at the end of the day, Firestar is just like, it doesn't make any difference, right? Like if you want Ultron on the team instead of me, I get it. Now, none of that's true, right? That's not the case at all, but it's also this kind of revelation that, hey, if you're going to be on the West Coast Avengers, you need to do something about your alcoholism. And Tony Stark's the best one to talk about that, right? I mean, there's a reason why it was such a significant moment in the Civil War event when he stood up and addressed the world and saying, I am an alcoholic. It was one of the first times in the history of Marvel Comics that he actually addressed that publicly. It was a part of his character that he always knew. Demon in a Bottle definitely focused on that, but it was him addressing it to the world. And that's kind of what Firestar has to do, because the first step to solving a problem is admitting that you have one. And that's when Blue Bolt catches up to her and is like, look, I know you don't like me, and that's fine. I know you're not a fan of me, but you do need to listen to what I have to say, because I do understand the idea of redemption. I do understand what it means for the world to look at you as a certain way because of your villainous acts, and to have to stand up and to try to prove to the world that you're no longer that person anymore. But one of the things that Firestar struggles with isn't really proving herself to the world. It's the fact that she's just dealing with so much pain and so much anguish because of everything that she'd experienced, and she didn't quite know how to handle it. And so that's when Blue Bolt says, look, you are an alcoholic. You need to come to terms with that, and you need to accept that, right? Like, I believe that you can get past it. I really, really do. But the first step to doing that is actually admitting that you have a problem. Not only that, because the West Coast Avengers team just appears to be so disorganized and appears to be just kind of all over the place and willy-nilly, Storm and Vision are kind of watching all of this unfold as official members of the main Avengers team. And they contact Tony Stark and they're like, dude, what are you doing, man? Like, why in the world do you have Ultron on your team? Like, you need to fill us in on what's happening. But again, that's where Tony Stark's like, no, Ultron's good. He let us in on his programming. It's not as bad as you think. And then just kind of ends the call so they can go deal with a follow-up thing that has to do with Stevel, right? Flag Smasher. But then as they're kind of observing everything, they realize that as much as Blue Bolt and Firestar seem to hate each other, opposites attract. And because of the conversation that they had in the past, that Firestar kind of comes out to the Avengers team and says, look, I am an alcoholic. Like, I do have a problem. She doesn't actually address it. She doesn't say the statement, I am an alcoholic. But Tony Stark understands exactly what she's saying, right? And that's a huge moment for anybody in the world, right? People inside this comic book or even people in the real world. It's a difficult thing to admit that you have such a severe problem, but it's also a huge step to take because it gives you the ability to get out there into the world and find some kind of solution to it, right? To find a way to get past your alcoholism and to overcome that addiction. Not only that, with Blue Bolt kind of following his own path of redemption and comforting Firestar in this moment where she makes this admission to herself and the rest of the team, she kind of tells him like, look, while I'm here in rehab, right, don't kill Tony Stark until I get out. And he's like, no promises, right? But there's clearly love there, right? They are romantically, they're romantically involved with each other. But then like the news shows up and starts like broadcasting this out, right? Like Firestar over here, like you got to show us everything, talk to us, that kind of thing. And Blue Bolt really actually keeps himself under control. Instead of being a hothead, right, and going after and attacking everybody, he says, maybe you guys should just chill. Even when like they kind of give him a hard time about his name Blue Bolt, right? They're like, we don't really care about you. Normally he would pop off and normally he would attack everybody, but he just like fries the guy's camera, right? And it's like, dude, my gear, and he's like, you're going to pay for that. Blue Bolt's like, I don't really care. But Tony Stark actually comes to him and is like, hey man, I get why you did what you did, right? Like this is a very vulnerable moment for Firestar, and all the press and all the news cares about is exploiting that vulnerability for ratings and that kind of thing, right? He's like, so I think it's cool that you kept yourself under control, but I'm also proud that you stood up for your friend in that way. And so that's where Blue Bolt's like, can I ask you for a favor? You know how you won't let me use my real name on the Avengers? And Stark's like, well, that's because, Killer Watt is not a hero name. And get off my shoulder pad because it's very undignified for you to be sitting there that way. And he's like, okay, but don't make me use Blue Bolt anymore. I don't want to use that name anymore. And so literally Stark's like, okay, well, you can be whoever you want to as long as you're not Killer Watt, which I'll be honest with you guys, that's a pretty dope name. I kind of dig that name. And he's like, okay, fine, right? I have a new name for everybody, right? He's like, you cameras, you news folks, you guys want to scoop? I have a new name for myself. From now on, you can call me Wonder Man. Well, it turns out Simon Williams is watching this in Paris, and he's pissed because from his concern, it's all like copyright infringements. This guy goes racing off to confront Blue Bolt and the West Coast Avengers over the fact that they jacked his name. More so than that, the rest of the Avengers team shows up here to confront Tony Stark about the fact that he's got Ultron on his team, which is a major problem that needs to be addressed. So likely it's going to lead to the West Coast Avengers fighting the Avengers. I don't know. The comic is disorganized as hell, but I love that because it feeds into how disorganized the team is. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.